Hello, guys. So, in this session, we are going to continue with our discussion on interpretation of statutes. In the last session that we just concluded, we've learned all our initial discussions. We've learned about what is a statute. We've learned about the definition of law. We saw the elements of a document. Then we learned about the meaning of instrument. We spoke about deed. This was the first part of our chapter. In the second part of our chapter, we learned what is interpretation. We learned about the different types of interpretations. Then we spoke about the difference between interpretation and construction. Then we discussed it, why do we need interpretation in the first place? And then we had a detailed discussion with respect to grammatical or literal interpretation. This is where we had ended our session in the last class. And now I'm starting for you the next part of our chapter. In this next part of the chapter, the third part of the chapter, which is the most important part of the chapter, you will be learning the primary rules of interpretation and the secondary rules of interpretation. So we are first of all focusing on the primary rules of interpretation. Under this, we have some 6 to 7 rules. We'll see them one by one. The very first rule that we're looking at is the rule of literal construction. Pay utmost attention, try your best to grasp as much as possible with me, because this is the most important part of this chapter. And there is unnecessary negativity around, about this chapter, that this is a bad chapter, it's a difficult chapter. Not really. See, I don't deny that the language is a little, on the higher side in this chapter. It's not normal English in this chapter. We also have some Latin maxims and all to learn over here. But however, it's not that bad a chapter as well. So with utmost positivity, with a nice positive vibe, with a mindset, with a will to learn, you listen to this chapter and take it from me. You will be fine. You will be comfortable with the chapter. Listen. So the rule of literal construction, this is the first rule of a construction. Now, this rule of literal construction is often called as a cardinal rule. Cardinal rule means it is the most important rule. It is the first rule which any court will apply. See, why are we talking about the rules of interpretation? Whenever the court is interpreting the law, see, let's say there is a case before the court. Now, the court has to apply the law. So, the court has to interpret the law. Because, see, the person who made the law and the person who's going to apply the law are two different people. We've already spoken about it. The parliament, the legislature, they've made the law. But it is the court who's going to apply the law. So, when the court is applying the law, the court will have to read the law and interpret the law. So at that time, the court will follow some rules. So the very first rule, the most important rule, the cardinal rule, the most primary rule that the court will follow is the rule of literal construction. Now, this rule of literal construction, it is a cardinal rule of interpretation. We also have a Latin maxim over here, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget. We don't care about correct pronunciation. The pronunciation which helps us get our spellings right, that is correct pronunciation for us. So, Latin maxim, extremely important, has to be written in your answer. Absoluta sententia expositor non indeget. Just knowing the Latin maxim is not enough. You should also know what it means. It means that plain words require no explanation. So point number 1, the rule of cardinal interpretation, the rule of literal construction. This is going to be my first rule. This is going to be my cardinal rule. Then point number 2, we learned the Latin maxim, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget. Plain words require no explanation. Come on, guys, repeat it along with me 5 times. Let's repeat the Latin maxim, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget, which means plain words require no explanation. Again, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget, which means plain words require no explanation. Third time, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget, which means plain words require no explanation. Fourth time, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget, which means plain words require no explanation. And the last time, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget, which means that plain words require no explanation. So this is our first primary rule. Our first primary rule is a rule of literal construction. The rule of literal construction, it is a cardinal rule. Whenever the courts are applying any law, the very first rule that every court follows is a rule of literal construction. The rule of literal construction has a Latin maxim, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget, which means that plain words require no explanation. Now, what does this rule say? This rule says that we will first of all always look at the ordinary, natural, grammatical, and plain popular meaning of the words ONGPP. We will look at the ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, popular meaning. I keep giving you these small mnemonics here and there so that these keywords get registered in your memory really well. Because see, when it comes to interpretation of statutes chapter, the examiner is actually a little bothered about the kind of language that we use. So if he finds all these 5 words in an answer paper, it will actually make a difference to his correction. All right. So all the 5 words have to enter the answer paper. So we will look at the ONGPP meaning, ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, popular meaning. Again, ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, popular meaning. If this meaning happens to be simple, if this meaning is unambiguous, then we will stick to the meaning. Don't you think, guys? Only if the words are, see, if this ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, popular meaning, if this is simple, if this is clear, if this is unambiguous, then is there any scope for any further interpretation? If the meaning, if the natural meaning, if the ordinary meaning of the words is plain, clear, and unambiguous, do you require any more interpretation, guys? No, right? Which means I am reading the law. When I read the law, I understood the law. It was very, very extraordinary. It was very, very simple. It was very, very straightforward. It was unambiguous. It was clear. Now, do I need any further interpretation? Do I have to look here and there for more interpretations? No. That is what this rule says. So this rule says that you should always look at the ordinary, natural, plain, ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, popular meaning. If that meaning is simple, if that meaning is clear, that meaning is unambiguous, you don't need any further interpretation. You can stop your entire interpretation process there itself. Okay, but however, if this meaning happens to be ambiguous, if this normal ordinary meaning happens to be ambiguous, then yes, we will look at other sources. Then we will have to, find the real intention of the lawmaker and all of that. But if the ordinary meaning, if the plain meaning is simple and if it is unambiguous, then we can end our whole interpretation process there itself. Then the fourth point says, if two interpretations are possible, one which is narrow interpretation and one which is wider interpretation, which of the two interpretations are we supposed to pick? If two interpretations are possible, one which is a narrow interpretation and the other which is a wider interpretation, which interpretation are we supposed to pick? We are supposed to pick that interpretation which is in line with the intention of the lawmaker. See, I'll give you one example. I'll help you understand. Now, your Companies Act in your meetings chapter, if you recall section 1 or 2, which talks about the contents of the notice. Now, in the contents of the notice, we are trying to make maximum disclosure possible, guys. Through the notice, we're trying to tell the shareholders all the matters, all the points with respect to the business that we're going to discuss in the meeting. Why are we trying to make so much disclosure in the notice? Because we're trying to give all the information relevant to the members so that at home itself they can do the analysis and they can come to the meeting after making, after doing a thorough analysis. And when they come into the meeting, now they know that whether they have to vote yes or whether they have to vote no. If the shareholders come to the meeting and in the meeting only if I give them all the information about that particular matter and on the spot if I ask them to make a decision, the decision may not be right. So therefore, the whole objective of sending such a detailed notice to the shareholders is that at home itself, I've given them all the information about the matter. They will do their thorough analysis. They will do their thinking. They will come to the meeting, with a well-informed mind. And do they have to vote yes or do they have to vote no? They've thoroughly thought about this whole situation. So in the contents of the notice, one of the points, if you remember, if the director is having any interest in the matter, then the director's interest has to be disclosed in the notice. Do you recall? In the matter which we are going to discuss in the meeting, in that matter, if any director has any connection, if the director has any interest, that interest has to be disclosed in the notice. Now, let's say there is a particular matter and I am a director of the company and I am not interested in the matter, but my relative is interested in the matter. Should that also be disclosed? See, if you do a narrow interpretation, then only the director's interest has to be disclosed. Relative's interest does not have to be disclosed. But if you do a wider interpretation, then we are trying to make maximum possible disclosure. So even disclose relative's interest. So now, what is the intention of the lawmaker? Through the notice, the lawmaker is trying to make maximum possible disclosure, guys. We will be able to achieve that only if we disclose not only the director's interest, but also the relative's interest. So if you notice in this entire story which I just told you, there were two possible interpretations. One interpretation was that only director's interest has to be disclosed. The wider interpretation is that the director's interest also has to be disclosed. His relative's interest also has to be disclosed. Both has to be disclosed. The whole objective of the lawmaker is to give maximum possible disclosure. Now, that will be possible only if I make a wider interpretation over here. Disclose director's interest also, disclose relatives' interest also. Only then I will be able to achieve maximum possible disclosure. So, two interpretations were possible in my example. One was a narrow interpretation and one was a wider interpretation. So, whenever two interpretations are possible, we will always choose that particular interpretation which is as per the intention of the lawmaker. Okay, guys. Then coming to the next point, the fifth point under this rule, if two interpretations are possible, one which is literal interpretation and the other which is as per the intention of the legislature, which of the two will you choose, guys? If two interpretations are possible, one which is literal interpretation and the other which is as per the lawmaker's intention, see, don't you think in a perfect world, both of these interpretations are supposed to be same? In a perfect scenario, don't you think the literal interpretation and the interpretation as per the lawmaker's intention, both are supposed to be the same? But if they are different, then which of the two will you follow? You will obviously follow the interpretation which is as per the lawmaker's intention. If two interpretations are possible, one which is literal interpretation and the other which is as per the lawmaker's intention, and if these two interpretations are different, we should not stay stuck to the literal interpretation. We should choose the intention, we should choose the interpretation which is as per the lawmaker's interpretation, which is as per the lawmaker's intention. Understanding, guys. And then coming to one final point in this entire primary rule. In the first primary rule, one final point, if the word happens to be a technical word, the technical word always has to be understood in technical sense. Technical words have to be understood in technical sense, which means, like, for example, let's say you're reading some, let's say there's a journal entry in accounts and you find this word DR over there. Now, DR in accounts is a technical word. It refers to debit. So you can't give it doctor meaning. It's a technical word. It means debit in accounts. It's a technical word. It has to be read in technical sense only. So if it's a technical word, it has to be read in technical sense. So these are my 6 points under the first rule, which is the rule of literal construction. Now let me give you a quick summary of this rule. Listen to me. See, what are we talking about? We are talking about the primary rules of interpretation. And under the primary rules of interpretation, the first rule that we're learning about is the rule of literal construction. Now, what are all the points that we have spoken about under the rule of literal construction? Let's revise over here. Our very first point under the rule of literal construction was that this is a cardinal rule. Cardinal rule means this is the most basic rule. This is the most important rule. This is the first rule which any court will apply while, while interpreting a law. Then after this, once again. Yeah. Then after this, the second point that we learned in the rule was the Latin maxim. What was the Latin maxim? Try to recall. We had learned absoluta sententia, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget. Yes, guys, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget, which means that plain words require no explanation. This was the meaning. Then after this, we learned that we're always supposed to look at the ONGPP meaning. That is, we are supposed to look at the ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, and popular meaning. If this meaning happens to be simple, if this meaning happens to be unambiguous, if this meaning happens to be clear, then in that case, any further interpretation is not required. The interpretation process ends here itself. I read the law, I understood the law, it was simple. Now, no further discussion, no further interpretation is required. Then after that, we learned the next point after this was, if two interpretations are possible, one interpretation which is narrow and the other interpretation which is wider, which of the two interpretations should we choose? We should choose that interpretation which is as per the intention of the lawmaker. In my example, through the notice of the meeting, we are trying to make maximum possible disclosure. That's a lawmaker's intention. So therefore, we gave a wider interpretation. Then after this, we learned again, if two interpretations are possible, out of which one interpretation is a literal interpretation and the other interpretation is as per the lawmaker's intention. Now, out of these two, obviously, we are always supposed to give priority to the interpretation which is as per the lawmaker's intention. We should not stay stuck to the literal interpretation. We should always keep the lawmaker's intention right on top. Then after this, we had finally learned one last point, that in case the word happens to be a technical word should not be understood in ordinary sense. Technical word should not be understood in ordinary sense. Technical word should be understood in technical sense only. Technical word should be understood in technical sense only. Okay, guys, this was our first rule, the rule of literal construction. All the points under literal construction, I've summarized it for you over here. Number one, it's a cardinal rule. Number two, we learned the Latin maxim over here, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget, which means that plain words require no explanation. Then we learned that if I will look at the ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, popular meaning, if it is simple, if it is unambiguous, if it is clear, then no further explanation is even required. Then we learned if two interpretations are possible, one which is narrow and one which is wide, we will choose the interpretation which is more in line with the lawmaker's intention. Then we learned if two interpretations are possible, one which is literal and the other which is as per the lawmaker's intention, then we will obviously choose the interpretation which is as per the lawmaker's intention. And finally, we said the technical words will be interpreted in technical sense. All right, guys, this was my very first rule, which was the rule of literal construction. Now, let me take you to the second rule. This is going to be the rule of reasonable construction. The rule of reasonable construction. Let me explain this to you. Look at this. Let me explain it to you over here. We have spoken about the rule of literal construction. That was our first primary rule. Coming to the second primary rule, the rule of reasonable construction. Now, this is called as the golden rule of interpretation. Literal construction was the cardinal rule of interpretation, and the second rule, the rule of reasonable construction, this is a golden rule of interpretation. Here also we have a Latin maxim, ut res magis valeat quam periet, which means that words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Come on, guys, let's learn up the Latin maxim. What was the Latin maxim that we have already learned under literal construction? There we said that absoluta sententia expositor non indeget. Here we are saying ut res magis valeat quam periet. Once again, ut res magis valeat quam periet. Again, ut res magis valeat quam periet. What does it mean? Words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Ut res magis valeat quam periet. Words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Again, ut res magis valeat quam periet, which means words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Ut res magis valeat quam periet. Words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Now, what does all this mean? Very, very simple. See, listen, if two interpretations are possible, okay, one interpretation which furthers the object and gives effect to the law, and the other interpretation which reduces the law to futility, obviously, which interpretation will we choose, guys? We will choose that interpretation which furthers the object and gives effect to the law. Let me help you understand this in simpler words. See, if two interpretations are possible, one interpretation helps us achieve the object of the law, and the other interpretation is making the law useless. Then obviously we will choose the interpretation which helps us achieve the object of the law, guys. This rule says that no doubt the court will first try the rule of literal construction. The court will first try to give literal interpretation. The court will first try to look at the ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, popular meaning. But if that meaning is not fair, or if that meaning is not reasonable, then the court cannot stick to it. Court can't say literal, 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 and the court can't stick to the literal interpretation. If the ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, popular meaning is not fair, if it is not reasonable, then the court should not stick to it. Then in that case, the court has a duty now. What duty? The court has to depart from the dictionary meaning, the court has to ignore the literal meaning, and the court has to find that interpretation from some other source which will advance the remedy and suppress the mischief. That is, if the plain, ordinary, natural, grammatical meaning is absurd, then the court should not stick to that literal interpretation. The court should ignore the literal interpretation. The court should depart from the letter of the law, and the court should try to find the real interpretation of the law, the real meaning of the law from other sources. The court should find that interpretation which will advance the remedy and suppress the mischief. Advance the remedy means the court should find that interpretation which will help us solve the problem because of which this law was created. It should help us, it should help us meet the solution, and it should help us solve the problem. So this is your rule of reasonable construction. It's a golden rule of interpretation. Ut res magis valeat quam periet, which means words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Which means don't stay stuck to the literal interpretation. If the literal interpretation is not fair, if it is not reasonable, then the court has a duty now to ignore the letter of the law and to find the spirit of the law from other sources. The court has a duty now to find that interpretation which will help us advance the remedy and suppress the mischief. This is your rule of reasonable construction. I'll again help you understand this a little better by giving you a summary over here. The rule of reasonable construction. The first point I told you over here was that the rule of reasonable construction is your golden rule of interpretation. This rule of interpretation, the reasonable construction rule, what is the Latin maxim over here? The Latin maxim is ut res magis valeat quam periet, which means that words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Which means we should always give a sensible meaning to the words. See, if two interpretations are possible, one interpretation is helping us achieve the object of the law, and the other interpretation is reducing the law to futility. Futility means what? Futility means useless, guys. So if two interpretations are possible, one interpretation which is going to help us achieve the objective, and the other interpretation which is going to make the law useless only, obviously we are supposed to choose that interpretation which will help us achieve the object. Then after this, we learned that yes, no doubt, we're always supposed to apply the rule of literal interpretation first. No doubt, we are always supposed to look at the ONG-PP meaning. We're supposed to look at the ordinary, natural, grammatical, plain, popular meaning. But if this meaning happens to be not fair, or if this meaning is not reasonable, then in that case, the court has a duty now. What duty? Now the court has a duty that the court cannot stay stuck to the literal interpretation. The court will have to depart from the letter of the law. Depart from the letter of the law means the court has to ignore the literal interpretation, ignore the words. The court has to find the spirit of the law. Spirit of the law means the real intention of the lawmaker. Now, the court will have to depart from the letter of the law, find the spirit of the law. The court will have to find that interpretation which will help us in advancing the remedy. The court will have to find that interpretation which will help us to advance the remedy and suppress the mischief. That's all, guys. This is your second primary rule, which is a rule of reasonable construction. Here, your Latin maxim is ut res magis valeat quam periet, which means that words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. This is your golden rule of interpretation. This rule says that in case there are two interpretations, one which will help us achieve the object and the other which will reduce the lot of utility, obviously you should choose that interpretation which will help us achieve the object. Then we learned if the ordinary natural grammatical plain popular meaning, if it happens to be not fair or if it is not reasonable, then the court cannot stick to it. The court will have to take up the responsibility now to ignore the letter of the law and to find the spirit of the law from other sources. The court will have to find that interpretation which helps us advancing the remedy and suppressing the mischief. In other words, the court has to do a reasonable interpretation. The court has to find a sensible interpretation. Getting it, guys? This is your second secondary rule. The second primary rule. The first primary rule was the rule of literal construction. Latin maxim here was absoluta sententia expositor non indiget, which means plain words require no explanation. This rule said that if the ordinary natural grammatical plain popular meaning, if it is simple, if it is unambiguous, if it is clear, then there is no scope for any further explanation, no need to do any further thinking, any further discussion. Story ends there itself. Rule of reasonable construction, the Latin maxim here is ut res magis valeat quam periet, which means that the words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Reasonable construction, this rule says that if the ordinary natural grammatical plain popular meaning, if it is not fair, if it is not reasonable, we can't stick to that literal interpretation. Then in that case, the court has a duty, the court has to depart from the letter of the law, and the court has to find the spirit of the law. The court has to find that interpretation which will help us advance a remedy and suppress the mischief. Find the spirit of the law means what? Spirit of the law means what? The real intention of the lawmaker. Crystal clear, guys? This was our discussion with respect to the first two primary rules, the rule of literal construction and the rule of reasonable construction. Then coming to my third point, my third rule, the rule of harmonious construction. What does this rule say? The rule of harmonious construction. This is the third rule. This is a very, very logical rule. This rule says, do not read each section separately. Read the entire statute as a whole. Understanding harmony. Harmony means what? Together. Harmony means bringing everything together. So the rule of harmonious construction says, do not read every section, every provision separately. Do not read every word separately. Read the entire statute as a whole. In case you're finding that two sections in the act are contradicting each other, please read them in such a way that you're able to give effect to both of them. Try to solve the conflict, try to give effect to both of them. I'll give you one simple example. Income Tax Act first says in section 37 that if you've incurred any expense which is connected to your business and it is a revenue expenditure, then you can claim deduction. If you've incurred any expense, it is a business related and it is not capital expenditure, then you can claim deduction. Later, the same Income Tax Act in one more section, section 43B says that there are some expenses, if you don't make the payment, you will not get the deduction. So don't you think they are contradicting? Section 37 is saying if the expense is business related, take deduction. But section 43B is saying only if you make the payment, only then you will get the deduction. These two are contradicting, right? So how will you resolve the conflict? How will you remove the conflict? Read them both together. We will see that generally business expenses, you get deduction. But those 6 to 7 expenses which are written in 43B, those expenses you will get deduction only if number one, they are business related, and number two, you should also make the payment within due date. You will read both the sections together. Section 37 is saying if the expense is business related, only then you will get a deduction. Section 43B is saying that you are supposed to make payment only if you make the payment, only then you will get the deduction. So these two are contradicting with each other. So what will we do now? we will give that interpretation which brings both the sections together. We will interpret it like this. We'll say, generally all expenses which are business related allowed, take a deduction. But the 5 to 6 expenses which are given in this section, those expenses you should also make payment. Just because you're business related, that is not enough. You should also make payment. Only then we will allow you to take a deduction. So if two sections are contradicting each other, try to interpret in such a way that you are able to give meaning to both the sections. Alright guys, and in case there's any doubt in the interpretation of a section, try to give such an interpretation which is in harmony with the intention of the lawmaker. Obviously, right, when there is a doubt about the meaning of the words, it should be understood in the sense in which it harmonizes with the intention of the enactment. Did you understand this? If I'm not able to understand the meaning of a word, I should keep in mind the intention of the lawmaker, and with that in my mind, I should interpret the meaning of the words. So I should give that interpretation which harmonizes, which is in line with the intention of the lawmaker. Okay, then this I've told you that when two provisions not able to, if two provisions are contradictory, you should read them both together and you should try to give effect to both of them. Then this also I've told you, do not read every section, every word separately. Read the statute as a whole. See what is the context in which the words are being used. See what is the context in which the provision is being given. Keep all that in mind while interpreting the section. Okay, but listen. Sometimes it is just not possible to remove the conflict. Sometimes the conflict is so evident that it is impossible to remove the conflict. It is impossible to give effect to both. Like for example, I'll give you one example. Companies Act says that we are supposed to apply the Schedule 3 format while preparing financial statements. Okay. And in fact, Companies Act says, if you look at the applicability of Companies Act, it says that the Companies Act is applicable to insurance companies also. Now, in the Companies Act, a format is given for financial statements in Schedule 3. No doubt, the Schedule 3 format is not applicable for insurance companies. Clearly, it's mentioned in the Companies Act. Companies Act clearly mentions that the Schedule 3 format is not applicable to insurance companies. Let us say for a moment it was not written like that. Let us say it was written Schedule 3 is applicable for every company. Okay, so Companies Act is saying that companies have to follow Schedule 3 format. Now, Insurance Act gives its own format for preparation of financial statements. Now, these two formats are totally different from each other. It is impossible to read them both together. In such case, what will you do? You will apply the Latin maxim generalia specialibus, non-derogant. Generalia specialibus, non-derogant, which means the specific rule will apply over the general rule. Which is more specific? The Insurance Act is more specific. You will apply this over Companies Act. So this will get the first priority. So in case there are two provisions and it is impossible for you to reconcile both the provisions, if it is impossible for you to read them both together, then you see which of the two provisions is more specific and you apply that provision. You give that one priority. Specific will prevail over general. Generalia specialibus, non-derogant. Again, generalia specialibus, non-derogant. Understood, guys? Yes, then listen to my next part of the discussion. We have some specific words which are used in the statute sometimes. This word subject to, then notwithstanding, then we have this word without prejudice. These three words, if used in the statute, give a lot of clarity to the interpretation process. Listen to me. If the section has the word subject to, it means that the section itself is saying that I am a subservient section. Subservient section means what? That I am a subordinate section. If some other section is conflicting with me, you apply that some other section. Are you understanding? If the section has the word subject to, it means that section is saying I am subordinate. If any other section is contradicting with me, you apply that other section. Apply me last. Generally, when we use the word subject to, the section is talking about a particular subject matter. And there is another section which is talking about the same subject matter. Let us say section 10, section 11. Section 10 is talking about a subject matter, and section 11 is also talking about the same subject matter. Let us say section 10 says I am subject to section 11. If section 10 says subject to section 11, then which of the two will you apply on the subject matter first? Both sections talking about the same subject matter. Section 10 says subject to section 11, which means section 10 is saying I am subservient, I am subordinate. Apply section 11 first, only then apply section 10. So the same subject matter is covered by that provision, section 10, and another provision, section 11, subject to which it operates. And if there's a conflict between these two sections, you will apply the later section. What's the later section? When I say latter section, I mean section 10 is saying I am subject to section 11. So section 11 becomes a latter section. I will apply the latter section over the former section. Provision that uses the word subject to becomes subservient to another. You understood the word subservient, guys? Yes, guys, please do not lose track. Which rule are we learning? This is a big rule, so do not lose track. We are learning about Companies Act. We are learning about harmonious construction. The rule of harmonious construction, which says do not read every section independently. Do not read every provision separately. Read the statute as a whole. If two sections are conflicting with each other, please read them both together and try to give such an interpretation which is, by which you're able to give effect to both the sections. If you're trying to find an interpretation, choose that interpretation which is in harmony with the intention of the lawmaker. Then we learned if it is totally not possible to remove the conflict, then you apply the rule generalia specialibus non derogant. Generalia specialibus non derogant, which means specific will prevail over general. Specific will prevail over general. Okay, which means that if I have two sections, you see which is more specific and you apply that over the general provision. Then we started learning some specific words. Our very first discussion was about this word subject to. Okay, subject to means that this section is going to be subservient. This section is going to be subservient. It is going to be subordinate. If any other section is conflicting with this section, you apply that some other section and don't apply this one. Alright guys, see, I'll show you one example. Give me a moment. This is an example from the Companies Act, okay? The Companies Act 2013, Section 47, which talks about voting rights, says subject to the provisions of Section 43. Which means if section 43 and section 47, if they contradict with each other, which of the two will you apply? You will obviously apply section 43. You will apply the latter section. Section 47 is saying I am subject to the provisions of section 43. Section 43 becomes the latter provision. You will apply the latter provision and not section 47 in case they conflict with each other. Okay, now coming to the second word, notwithstanding. If the section has the word notwithstanding, then you call that section as a section with a non-obstante clause. Generally when a section starts with the word notwithstanding, you call it as a non-obstante clause. It is a total opposite of subject to. When I write subject to, it means I am saying I am a subservient section. But when I use the word notwithstanding, it indicates I am saying that I am the dominant section. I am the stronger section. If any other section is conflicting with me, you apply me first and then only the other sections. Like section 43B of income tax, which I was telling you about just now, section 43B starts with the word notwithstanding, which means you will apply section 43B over every other section. We are understanding. Now, this notwithstanding can operate in 4 different levels. The section can say notwithstanding another section. Like for example, I'm just giving you random examples, okay? Section 10 can say, notwithstanding anything written in section 11, which means section 10 is going to override section 11. Between section 10 and 11, if there's any conflict, you will apply section 10. So the first level of notwithstanding is that it is going to be dominating another section, or the section can say notwithstanding anything contained in a statute. Like the section 10 can say notwithstanding anything written in Companies Act 2013. Section 10 of Companies Act is saying notwithstanding anything contained in Companies Act, which means entire Companies Act. If there's any conflict with section 10, section 10 only will prevail. Then the third level is it can say notwithstanding anything in a section of another statute. Like section 10 of Companies Act can say notwithstanding anything contained in section 11 of Income Tax Act. So if section 10 of Companies Act and if section 11 of Income Tax Act, if these two are contradicting, which of the two will you apply? Section 10 of the Companies Act. So, and the last level, the most dominating level, it can say notwithstanding anything in any other statute. Like for example, section 10 can say notwithstanding anything contained in any other statute, which means if any other law in force is contradicting with that section number 10, then section 10 only will apply and not any other law. So notwithstanding can be applied in 4 different levels. Either it can be notwithstanding anything contained in a specific section, or it can be notwithstanding anything contained in the entire act, or it can be notwithstanding a specific section of another act, or it can be notwithstanding anything contained in any law for the time being in force. Understood, guys? Yes, see, I'll show you an example. Again, from Companies Act, I'll show you an example. Section 29, which talks about securities to be dealt in demat form. Section 29 says, notwithstanding anything contained in any other provisions of this act, every company making public offer and such other classes of companies shall issue securities in demat form. Do you recall this provision prospectus chapter, guys? If my company is making a public offer, or if my company happens to be a specified company, that is unlisted company, if you remember, what are the prescribed companies? Unlisted public companies. So if my company is making a public offer, or if my company is a prescribed company, then it has to issue securities in demat form only. This section says, notwithstanding anything contained in any other provisions of this act, which means section 29 on one side, the entire Companies Act on the other side. If in the entire Companies Act there's anything written which contradicts with section 29, which section will you apply? You will apply section 29. Section 29 becomes the dominating section. Are you understanding? So notwithstanding can operate in 4 levels. The section can either be notwithstanding a specific section, or it can be notwithstanding the entire act, or it can be notwithstanding a specific section in some other act, or it can be notwithstanding anything contained in any other act. Is this crystal clear? Yes. So 2 things we have learned. Number 1, we learned about subject to. And number 2, we learned about notwithstanding, totally opposite to each other. Okay, guys, then we have another word, this word without prejudice. When I write the word without prejudice, it means, look at this, a particular provision follows a general provision, and it is stated that the particular provision is without prejudice to the general provision. Let us say we have section 10 and then we have section 11. Section 10 talks about something general. Section 11 talks about something specific, something particular. And section 11 is saying without prejudice to section 10. If this is the case, it means section 11 is saying apply section 10 also, apply section 11 also. the particular provision, section 11, will not restrict the operation. See, generally what do we do? If we have a general provision and if we have a specific provision, which of the two do we apply? We apply the specific provision, right? But the specific provision is saying without prejudice to section 10, without prejudice to the general section, which means section 11 is saying apply section 10 also, in addition to section 10, apply me also. Without prejudice is generally read as in addition to. In addition to section 10, you apply me also. Do not damage section 10. You apply section 10. Do not undermine section 10. You apply section 10 also. In addition to, guys, this is a key word. In addition to section 10, you apply section 11 also. Understood, guys? Yes, now listen, I'll show you an example. It will help you understand this concept really well. Look at this. I'm showing you section number 4. Section number 4, which talks about MOA. Section number 4, subsection 2 and subsection 3. Okay, subsection 2 is a general section. Subsection 2 is saying that the name should not be identical or similar to any other company's name. It's a very general section. But subsection 3 says without prejudice to subsection 2. That is, you apply section 2 also. In addition to that, a company shall not be registered with a name which contains words which will give the impression that company is connected to the central government. The second subsection is a very general subsection. It says that the name should not resemble the name of another company. The name should not be undesirable. The name should not become an offense. Subsection 3 is specifically saying that the name should not contain words which will indicate that the company is connected to the government, state government and all. It is specifically talking about that. So one is particular and one is specific. Generally out of these two, which will we apply? The more specific we will apply. But subsection 3 is saying without prejudice to. It means you apply subsection 2 also, which means the name should not be identical or similar to another company's name also. In addition to that, you apply subsection 3 also. The name should not contain words which will make people think the company's name is connected to the government. Are you understanding? So when I use the word subject to, I am saying that the section is subservient. The section is not strong. The section is a weaker section. If I use the word notwithstanding, then that section becomes a stronger section, a dominating section. If I use the word without prejudice to, it means in addition to. There is a general provision, there is a specific provision. Generally, specific will prevail over general because generalia specialibus non-derogant. But if it uses the word without prejudice to, it means the specific provision is saying you apply the general provision also, you apply the specific provision also. Now perfect understanding. Yes, now listen to the next discussion. The court has to give effect to all the parts of the statute, but this general principle is meant to guide the courts in furthering the intent of the legislature, not overriding it. If it is impossible to avoid inconsistency, provision which was enacted or amended later will prevail. We will try to resolve the conflict, we will try to bring harmony. In case harmony is not possible, we will try to see which is more specific. Specific will prevail over general, generalia specialibus non-derogant. But if there is nothing like one specific, one general, if both are operating on the same level, both the sections, not able to resolve the conflict, not able to pinpoint which is specific, which is general, then you see out of the two subsections, which of the sections was made later. Which of the sections was amended later? The latest section, you apply that. Perfect, guys. Yes, so this was our third rule of interpretation, which is the rule of harmonious construction. Our first rule was the rule of literal interpretation, absoluta sententia expositor non indigit. Absoluta sententia expositor non indigit. Our second rule of interpretation was the rule of reasonable construction, ut res magis valeat quam periet. Ut res magis valeat quam periet. Our third rule of interpretation, the rule of harmonious construction. The rule of harmonious construction says Always try to read both the sections together. Do not read every section separately. Read the law in such a way that you are able to give effect to every provision of the act. Right, guys? That is a basic crux of harmonious construction. Right? If there's a conflict, you try to read in such a way that you're able to give effect to both the provisions. If you are unable to give effect to both the provisions, you see which is more specific, you apply that. Generalia specialibus, non-derogant. Specific will prevail over general. Right. Then after that, we learned that in case you are unable to resolve the conflict, even after that, you see which of the two sections came later. Which of the two sections was amended later, you applied that one first. And then finally, we also learned three important words: subject to, notwithstanding, without prejudice to. If I write the word subject to, it means I'm saying that this section is subservient. This section is weaker section. If any other section is contradicting with this section, you apply that other section. Notwithstanding is saying I am the strongest section. It operates in 4 levels. Either it can be notwithstanding a specific section, or it may be notwithstanding the entire statute, or it may be notwithstanding a specific section of some other statute, or it may be notwithstanding the entire law in force. And then finally we learned about without prejudice. Without prejudice means there is a general provision, there is a specific provision. Generally, specific prevails over general. But the specific provision is saying without prejudice to the general provision, which means the specific provision has to be applied in addition to the general provision. Apply the general provision also. In addition to that, apply the specific provision also. Read them both and apply them both. So guys, with this you have learnt about 3 primary rules. You have learnt about the rule of literal construction. You have learnt about the rule of reasonable construction, and you have learnt about the rule of harmonious construction. In the rule of literal construction, your Latin maxim was absoluta sententia expositor non indeget, which means that plain words require no explanation. Then you learnt about the rule of reasonable construction, ut res magis valeat quam periet, which means that words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. Then we learnt about the rule of harmonious construction, where you spoke about the Latin maxim generalia specialibus non derogant, which means that the specific rule will always prevail over the general rule. We spoke about notwithstanding, subject to, without prejudice, and all of that. Now I'm taking you to the 4th rule of interpretation, which is much simpler than what you've learned already, and no Latin maxim also. The 4th rule, which is the Hayden's rule, also called as the rule of purposive construction, also called as the mischief rule. It has 3 names. It's called the Hayden's rule. It is also called as the rule of purposive construction, and it is also called as the mischief rule. Once again, it's called as a Hayden's rule, also called as the rule of purposive construction, and also called as a mischief rule. Now, when does this rule apply? See, if the language of the statute is capable of multiple interpretations. When the language is capable of multiple interpretations, if the same provision can be interpreted in multiple manners, and if I want to know that which interpretation am I supposed to choose, that is when we use the Hayden's rule, also called as a rule of purposive construction, also called as a mischief rule. Okay, so Hayden's rule of purposive construction or mischief rule. When does this rule apply? When the same provision has multiple possible interpretations, then if I want to know which interpretation am I supposed to pick, I can use this rule. This rule says when multiple interpretations are possible, and if you want to select one, please look at these 4 things. On the basis of these 4 things, choose that interpretation which will suppress the mischief and advance the remedy. Remember the same line we had seen even in the rule of reasonable construction. So Hayden's rule, also called as the rule of purposive construction, also called as the mischief rule. This rule says that if the same provision has multiple interpretations possible, then if you want to select one interpretation, look at these 4 things. On the basis of these 4 things, choose that interpretation which will help you suppress the mischief and advance the remedy. What are the 4 things? Number 1, like right now we have the Companies Act 2013. So what was the law before making of the act? So before 2013 we had the 1956 Act. So what was the law before making the act? Before the 2013 Act, what was the law earlier? Then in that earlier law, what was a mischief or what was a defect or what was a hardship in the earlier law? In 90, before, right now we have 2013 Act. Before that, what was the earlier law? Then in that earlier law, in that 1956 Act, what was a mischief or what was a defect or what was a hardship? Then the third point is, how does the parliament seek to resolve or cure the mischief? And what is the reason for the remedy? So in the Hayden's rule, they're asking us to look at these four things. Number one, what was the old law? Number two, what was a mischief? What was a defect in the old law? And number three, how is the parliament going to solve that mischief? How is the parliament going to solve or resolve the mischief or the deficiency? And what's the reason for the remedy? On the basis of these four matters, we will choose that interpretation which will suppress the mischief. Suppress the mischief means solve the problem and reach a solution, advance a remedy. All right. So let us revise this once again over here. We are talking about the fourth primary rule. Our fourth primary rule, which is the Hayden's rule. The Hayden's rule, which is also called as the rule of purposive construction. Hayden's rule, also called as the rule of purposive construction, also called as the mischief rule. This is your fourth rule of interpretation. Hayden's rule, purposive construction, or the mischief rule. First of all, what is the applicability of this rule? When does this rule even apply? See, when a particular provision is capable of multiple interpretation, when multiple interpretations are possible, when one particular provision can be interpreted in multiple manners, when multiple interpretations are possible, and we want to know out of these multiple interpretations, which interpretation are we supposed to choose? Multiple interpretations are possible. Which interpretation are we supposed to choose? When we want to find that out, that is when we use this rule. This rule says that you're supposed to consider four things. What are the four things? First of all, what was a law earlier? What was the earlier law? Then second thing, in this earlier law, what was the mischief or what was the defect? Basically, what was the hardship? What was the problem in this earlier law? Then point number three, how does the parliament think that what has the parliament decided? How is the parliament going to resolve this mischief, or how are they going to cure this mischief? And lastly, what is the reason for the remedy? So on the basis of these four things, we will choose that interpretation which will help us advance the remedy and suppress the mischief. That's all, guys. This is your Hayden's rule, also called as your mischief rule, also called as your rule of purposive construction. So this rule says that in case there are multiple interpretations possible and you want to know which interpretation has to be picked, you're supposed to first of all see what was the law earlier. Then see what was the mischief in the earlier law. Then how has the parliament decided to solve this mischief and what's the reason for the remedy? On the basis of these four, choose that interpretation which will help us advance the remedy and suppress the mischief. That's all, guys. This is our Hayden's rule, also called as a rule of purposive construction, also called as a mischief rule. So with this, you have understood the first four rules of interpretation. The first one, which was the rule of literal construction. The second one, which was the rule of reasonable construction. The third rule, which was the rule of harmonious construction. And now you've learned the fourth rule, which is your Hayden's rule. Coming to the fifth rule now, which is the rule of beneficial construction. Now, this is a very simple rule. This is in fact the easiest of all the primary rules, the rule of beneficial construction. See, I'll help you understand. Now, listen, let us say we are reading a law. Like, for example, let us say we are reading the Minimum Wages Act. Now, the Minimum Wages Act is a law which was made in our country immediately after independence, because you know very well that before independence, when the Britishers were ruling our country, they were literally harassing the lower class. they were not treating the Dalits very well, and the underprivileged people, the poor people, they were only getting oppressed and suppressed, because of which the labor class was working for multiple hours. They were working for, let's say, 16 to 17 hours in a day, but they were still getting very poor wages. So the labor class was being treated very poorly by the Britishers. So therefore, when our country got independence, right after independence in 1948 itself, the Minimum Wages Act was made, because of which the labor class was assured a certain minimum wages. So, do you agree, first of all, that this statute was created for a purpose? This statute was created why? This statute was created to improve the conditions of one particular class of people who were treated unfairly in the past. Do you agree with this English? Do you agree that this law was made to improve the conditions of a particular class of people who were treated unfairly in the past, guys? This law was created to give back the rights to the labor class, to improve their conditions. Now, listen. Let us say we are reading the Minimum Wages Act. When we are reading the Minimum Wages Act, if there is no ambiguity, then there is no scope of interpretation. Then there is no question of interpretation, guys. When does the question of interpretation arise? The question of interpretation arises only when there is some ambiguity. When I'm reading Minimum Wages Act, if there is no ambiguity, then there is no question of interpretation. But let us say, when I'm reading this law, there is some ambiguity. Something is unclear, there is some ambiguity. Now, in such case, I must read this law in a liberal manner. I must give it liberal interpretation. Why? Because this legislation is a beneficial legislation. This legislation was created to benefit a certain class of people. So when we are interpreting this law, we must interpret it in a liberal manner so that this law actually ends up giving the benefit to the people. Because what was the whole intention behind the lawmaker, guys? Don't you think his whole intention behind this law was to give benefits to a particular class of people? So, if there is ambiguity, we should read this law in such a manner that we are actually able to pass on the benefit to that certain class of people. We should do a liberal interpretation so that we are able to meet the lawmaker's intention and so that we are actually able to improve the conditions of the labor class. Understanding, guys, that's all. This is a rule of beneficial construction. This rule says that if you're reading a legislation, that legislation which was meant to improve the conditions of a certain class of people who were treated unfairly in the past, if you're trying to interpret such a legislation and if there is some ambiguity in this legislation, then you should interpret it in a liberal manner so that they're actually able to fulfill the lawmaker's intentions, so that we're actually able to improve the conditions of this particular class. If we give a very strict interpretation, we may not be able to pass on the benefit to this class of people. So if you're reading a beneficial law, for example, if you're reading any labor law, if you see, it was created with the objective of improving the quality of life, or it was made with the intention of improving the conditions of work of the labor class. So these are all laws which are made by the government for the benefit of the people, for the benefit of a particular class of people. So labor laws especially have to always be read in a liberal manner so that the labor class actually gets benefited by the law. Okay, this is your fifth rule of interpretation, which is your rule of beneficial construction. So what was your first rule? The rule of literal interpretation. Your second rule was the rule of reasonable construction. Your third rule was the rule of harmonious construction. Your fourth rule was the Hayden's rule, and your fifth rule is a rule of beneficial construction. Now comes our sixth rule, the most interesting rule of interpretation, my favorite rule of interpretation, which is ejus dum generis. Here in the name of the rule itself, we are having a Latin maxim, adjustum generis. Adjustum generis means of the same kind or species. Adjustum generis means of the same kind or species. I'll straight away explain it to you with the help of an example. Let's say I'm creating a list over here. The list has advanced accounts, costing, law, and GST. Okay. And then I'm putting this word, etc. Now, the question before the court is, what is the meaning of the word, etc.? The question before the court is, how do we interpret this word, etc.? Now, you answer my question. Will, etc. include history? Will, etc. include geography? Will, etc. include computer science? Will, etc. include financial management? Will it include direct tax? See, will it include history? No. Will it include geography? No. Will it include computer science? No. But will it include FM? Yes. And will it include DT? Yes. You have unknowingly applied adjustum generis. These are your most obvious answers, and you have unknowingly applied adjustum generis. What the whole concept of adjustum generis says is that, first of all, you are having an enumeration. Enumeration means what? Enumeration is just a fancy word for list. You're having a list. This list is containing specific words. This list is containing specific words. There are 4 specific words. These specific words are all belonging to a category. In our example, all of these belong to the category of your subjects at your intermediate level. But this category is not exhausted. Tell me, do you have only these 4 papers in your intermediate level? Is this list exhausting the category? Is it completing the category? No, you have other subjects also. And these specific words are later followed by a general word. So totally how many conditions, guys? Totally there are 5 conditions. Condition number 1, there's an enumeration. That enumeration contains specific words. Those specific words belong to a category. That category is not exhausted, and that list of specific words is followed by general words. If all these conditions are fulfilled, that is when we apply adjustum generis. Adjustum generis says if all these conditions are fulfilled, and if you want to understand the general word will also belong to the same category only. That is why under etc. I put other papers belonging to your intermediate. In your intermediate, you have FM and DT. So even this will fall under etc. But other papers over here, which are not a part of your intermediate, they will not form a part of etc. Are you understanding, everybody? So if there is an enumeration and the enumeration is containing specific words which belong to a particular category which is not exhausted by that list, and it is followed by some general words, then general words will also belong to the exact same category only. Understanding, everybody? Even the general words will belong to the same category only. This is your rule of adjustum generis, that even the general words will belong to the same category only. Getting it, guys? There's an enumeration, there's a list. That list is containing specific words. These specific words are belonging to one single category, but the category is not exhausted by the list. And these specific words are followed by a general word. Now, if I want to know what does this general word mean, even this general word will belong to the same category only, which means, do you agree if I say that the general word is going to derive meaning from the specific words? Specific words are all your intermediate subjects. So even general word will also be only intermediate subject. So I can say that the general word is going to take color from the specific words. The general words will derive color from specific words. Here, what does the word color mean? It will derive color from specific words. Here the word color means it will derive meaning from the specific words. So the specific words are all belonging to one particular category. Even the general word will belong to the same category. So the general word will derive meaning from the specific words. Okay. But however, there is a small catch. See, whenever the courts are doing interpretation, they don't have a choice. They have to do literal construction first. If literal construction is not fair, if it is not reasonable, they don't have a choice. They have to do reasonable construction. If there is one specific provision, there is one general provision, they don't have a choice. Specific will prevail over general. So all your other rules, the courts don't have a choice. All your other rules are mandatory rules. The court has to follow those rules. But adjustum generis is a discretionary rule, which means just because these conditions are fulfilled, the court does not have to follow this rule. It's not mandatory. It is discretionary. I am giving full power to the court. Court, listen, there's a list. The list is containing specific words. The specific words are belonging to a category. Category is not exhausted. It is followed by a general word. All conditions are fulfilled. Adjustum generis is possible. Court, it's up to you whether you want to apply adjustum generis. Whether you don't want to apply adjustum generis, that is up to you. Crystal clear? Understood. This is your rule of adjustum generis. So the rule of adjustum generis is discretionary, which means just because these conditions are fulfilled, it is not mandatory that the court has to apply. It's up to the court. Okay, guys, and one final point under this rule, there are some situations where this rule of adjustum generis is not applicable. When will this rule not apply? See, listen, situation number 1. When will this rule apply? Only if I have specific words which are followed by a general word, guys. But what if the preceding words also are general? If this list is specific words followed by a general word, only then I can apply adjustum generis. But if this list itself is containing here itself, if we are having general words, then we can't apply adjustum generis. Then second point, we can apply adjustum generis only if the specific words don't exhaust the category, guys. But if the specific words are already exhausting the genus, if they're already exhausting the genus is nothing but category. If they're already exhausting the category, then you can't apply this list. You can't apply this rule. Then number 3, you can apply this rule only if all of these words belong to one specific category. Only if all of these specific words belong to one specific category, only then you can apply this rule. But what if the specific words are diverse in nature? Diverse in nature means what if they belong to different categories? Then you can't apply this rule. And lastly, if the legislature, that is, if the lawmaker, if he has expressly stated that don't apply adjustum generis, if he has expressly stated that don't apply adjustum generis, then the court will not apply adjustum generis. Understanding? Yes, guys. So generally, whenever there is a list and if all these conditions are fulfilled, the court applies adjustum generis, wherein the general word derives meaning from the specific words. Even the general word will belong to the same category as the specific words. But this rule is discretionary of the court. And this rule will not apply in these 4 cases. This rule will not apply if the preceding words also are general words. If the specific words exhaust the whole category. If the specific words are diverse in nature. If the legislature itself has stated don't apply this rule, in such cases, we can't apply this rule. Alright guys, this was our entire learning with respect to adjustum generis. Alright, so with this, how many primary rules? 6 primary rules you have already learned. Your first primary rule was literal construction. Second was reasonable construction. Third was harmonious construction. Fourth was Hayden's rule, purposive construction. Fifth was beneficial construction. And now you have learned over here your 6th primary rule, which is ejusdem generis. You have only one more primary rule left to a seventh primary rule, which is the rule of exceptional construction. Okay, and then finally we have the last primary rule, which is the rule of exceptional construction. The last primary rule, the rule of exceptional construction. Exceptional construction says that you should not generally what happens is when the judge is interpreting the statute, okay, generally he should not ignore words. Generally he should give meaning to every word. If a word is there in the statute, it's there for a reason. That's a general rule. But then in exceptional construction, we are allowed to eliminate those words which make no sense. We are allowed to ignore those words which defeat the intention of the lawmaker. Okay, within exceptional construction, we have a few specific points. Number one, the common sense rule. Generally, we are supposed to give meaning to each and every word which is used in the statute. Generally, we are supposed to give meaning to each and every word which is used in the statute, because if a word is there in the statute, it will be there for a reason. But the common sense rule says that if the word is defeating the intention of the lawmaker, then please ignore that word. If the word is defeating the intention of the lawmaker, then please ignore that word. You understood the common sense rule, guys? Generally, what's a general rule? A general rule is that I am supposed to give the proper meaning. The general rule is that if there is a word in the statute, I am supposed to consider that word. A word will not be there in the statute unnecessarily. If it is there in the statute, I shouldn't ignore it. But if a particular word is defeating the intention of the lawmaker, then you please ignore it. That is a common sense rule. Then the conjunctive and disjunctive rule. The word and is conjunctive. Conjunctive means, you understand the meaning of the word and, right? If I put the word and, all the conditions should be fulfilled. If I put the word or, it is disjunctive. Or indicates any condition has to be fulfilled. This is a general rule. The general rule is that or is disjunctive and is conjunctive. But listen, if you give this interpretation that or is disjunctive and is conjunctive, if this interpretation is resulting in absurd results, then you try to give the opposite interpretation and you see if that is making more sense. Generally, or is disjunctive and is conjunctive. But if giving that meaning is not in line with the intention of the lawmaker, then you can give ulta meaning also. Finally, generally, the word may is directory. Remember, we saw this in the General Clauses Act. Generally, the word may is directory or enabling, and the word shall is mandatory or imperative. But sometimes we may use the words interchangeably. Sometimes, even though I'm using the word may, okay, even though I'm using the word may, the lawmaker might have used the word may just for courtesy's sake. His intention might be mandatory provision. Company may be formed for legal objects. Does it mean that company can be formed for illegal objects also? No, there the word may indicates only courtesy's sake. So even though I'm using the word may, company may be formed for legal objects, it has to be read as what? As shall. Lawmaker's intention cannot be to allow incorporating companies for illegal causes. Right, guys? So you have to see, generally may means directory and shall means mandatory. But also keep in mind the intention of the lawmaker. If it feels like the intention of the lawmaker would have been something else, then do not give the same interpretation. And then in that case, give the ulta interpretation. If I use the word may, but I also put a penalty in that section, then even though I'm using the word may, I will read it as shall. Understood? But see, if I use the word must, then there is no doubt. Must will always be mandatory. Must will never be read interchangeably and all. Must is always mandatory. This is important. We have to look at the substance and not merely the form. Always substance over the form. Here form indicates May is directory, shall is mandatory. But always substance over the form. Substance is the intention of the lawmaker. Intention of the lawmaker will override the general rule. The general rule is may is directory, shall is mandatory. But you also have to keep in mind the intention of the lawmaker. If the lawmaker's intention seems to be something else, if it seems to be the ulta, then we cannot apply this interpretation. We'll have to apply it the other way around. Understood, guys? All this discussion, you can give it a reading. It's very self-explanatory. If I'm going to use the word may, how should I interpret the word may? I should keep in mind the object of the act. I should keep in mind the context or the background in which the word is being used. I should keep in mind the purpose and the advantages of the act. When do I use the word may as shall? See, may generally indicates it is directory. But when should I read the word may with mandatory force? When should I read it as if it is mandatory? Number one, where the word may involves a discretion coupled with an obligation. Discretion means what? Discretion means it is not mandatory. So if the provision first of all gives you a choice, it gives you an option and also puts an obligation on you. I was telling you, right, that there is a section, let us say, which uses the word may and also puts a penalty. So it's using the word may indicates it's not mandatory, but they're putting an obligation on us that if we don't fulfill this provision, they will punish us. So it is giving us discretion first, but later it's putting obligation on us also. Even though it uses the word may, we will read it as shall. Then, when it gives a positive benefit, if the section is beneficial for us, we will read it as mandatory. Where remedy would be advanced and mischief will be suppressed. If I read the word may as shall, if I give this interpretation, if it is possible to advance a remedy and suppress the mischief because of this interpretation, then I will read may as shall. And obviously, if I give the word may a directory interpretation, not mandatory interpretation, if I give that meaning to the word may, if that's going to defeat the intention of the lawmaker, then I will read the word may as shall. Got it, guys? Simple, right? So we are already aware of this. Generally, the word may is directory and the word shall is mandatory. But in some cases, I will read them both interchangeably. I have to keep in mind the intention of the lawmaker and accordingly I have to interpret. Always substance over form. Intention of the lawmaker should always be priority. The word may is generally directory, but if it is coupled with obligation, penalty, if it is going to be beneficial for us, if it's going to advance the remedy and suppress the mischief, if giving the word may if giving the word may a directory interpretation is going to defeat the intention of the lawmaker, then even though it is a word may, I will read it as if it is shall. Okay, then coming to the word shall, this we know already. Again, we know that if I'm going to use the word shall, it indicates it is a mandatory provision. We have to follow the provision. But if I give mandatory meaning, okay, if it's going to result in an absurd interpretation, or if it is going to be against the intention of the lawmaker, then I will give it interpretation as if it is may. See, may be read as shall sometimes, shall may be read as may sometimes, but must will never be used interchangeably. Must is always mandatory, must is always compulsory. Understood, guys? So if I'm going to use the word may, I will read it as shall. If I use the word shall, sometimes I may reuse it as may, but must is always mandatory. When will I read the word may as shall? I told you. When will we use the word shall as may? If giving the word shall a mandatory meaning is making it absurd, weird, or if it is against the intention of the lawmaker, then even though I use the word shall, I will read it as if it is directory. This we've already discussed. If a specific penalty is given, we will read it as mandatory provision only. All right, guys. I think that is it with this discussion. See, look at this. In the same section, I'm using the word shall for one matter. I'm using the word may for another matter. The same section talks about two things. For this part, it is using the word shall, and for this part, it is using the word may. Then it is very obvious that this is mandatory and this is directory. Same section is using both the words. For this matter, it is using the word shall. For this matter, it is using the word may. Then you will not interchange and all, because same section is using both the words. If they wanted to interchange, they would have written it accordingly. Same section is using both the words, which means this provision you will read it as mandatory provision or imperative provision, and this provision you will read it as directory provision or enabling provision. All right, so this is it, I think, about a discussion regarding may and shall, the rule of exceptional construction. Within the rule of exceptional construction, we have three sub rules. The first one says, the common sense rule says, generally we are supposed to give meaning to every word in the law. We are supposed to give meaning to every word in the law generally. But if any particular word is against the intention of the lawmaker, I can ignore that word. Then we learn generally the word or is disjunctive and the word and is conjunctive. That is, when I see the word or, I read it as optional. When I read the word and, I read it as both. Both together have to be fulfilled. But in case it is against the intention of the lawmaker, I may have to interpret them differently. Finally, we learnt about may and shall. May is generally directory or enabling, and shall is generally mandatory, imperative. But I may have to use them interchangeably, but must is always mandatory. Alright guys, so with this we have learnt all the primary rules of interpretation. What were the primary rules of interpretation, guys? The first primary rule was literal construction, absoluta sententia expositor non indeget. Second rule was reasonable construction, ut res magis valeat quam periet. What was the third rule? The third rule was harmonious construction, generalia specialibus, non-derogant. The fourth was beneficial construction. We did not have any rule over here, but there were four names to it. Beneficial construction, purposive construction, Hayden's rule, mischief rule. Advance the remedy, suppress the mischief. The fifth rule was ejusdem generis, same kind and species. Sixth rule was exceptional construction, which spoke about three things: common sense rule, then number two, and or conjunctive disjunctive, mandatory and enabling, mandatory and directory, may and shall. Crystal clear with our primary rules, guys? I hope you're feeling a little confident about our discussion till here, the primary rules. Yes, after this, now we have to learn about the secondary rules. We have only two secondary rules. All right. There are totally two secondary rules only, but three Latin maxims to learn. The first secondary rule is about usage or practice. We know what is usage. Even in the last session, we came across this word 2 to 3 times. Usage is nothing but customs. Okay, see, if we have been interpreting a particular word in a certain manner since ages and ages, now we have to continue to give the same meaning to that word even hereafter. I'll repeat again. If we have been interpreting a certain word in a certain manner since ages and ages, now we have to continue to give the same meaning to that word. Does it make sense to you? Right? See, listen, there are two Latin maxims over here. One is optima legum inter praesest consuetudo. Here, no doubt, I totally agree, the spellings are a little tricky. Optima legum inter praesest consuetudo. Optima legum inter praesest consuetudo, which means custom is the best interpreter of law. This means whatever is the customary interpretation of that particular word. If a particular word has been interpreted in a certain manner since years and years, you please continue to give that same interpretation. Okay, then we have another Latin maxim, contemporanea expositio est optima et fortissima in lege. Contemporanea expositio est optima. Optima means best. Fortissima means strong. Legge means law. Contemporary exposition is the best and strongest in law. In simple words, what this means is, see, I'm very sure you'll agree with me that the meaning of a word undergoes changes over time. Do you agree with me? A word undergoes changes over time. Like, for example, if you look at Shakespeare's plays, if you see the kind of words which are used in his plays, those words either are not even used today or they have different meanings today. So the meaning of words change over time. Okay, so what we should do is, if we want to interpret the law correctly, we have to go back in time and we have to see at that time when the law was made, at that time what was the meaning of that particular word. That will help us understand better what the intention of the lawmaker is. This is called contemporary exposition. Contemporanea expositio, contemporary exposition, which means go back in time. Go back to the time when the law was made. Long, long ago, at that time you see what was the meaning of that word. At that time you see what meaning did people generally give to that particular word, and you'd apply that meaning. That will be in the line. That will be in line with the intention of the lawmaker. So we have two Latin maxims here. Optima legum interpressest consuetudo. Again, optima legum interpressest consuetudo, which means custom is the best interpreter of law. Optima legum interpressest consuetudo, which means custom is the best interpreter of law. Second Latin maxim is contemporanea expositio est optissima et fortissima in lege, which means that the best way to interpret a document is to read it as if it would have been read when it was made. Understood, guys? Yes, this is a first secondary rule, which is usage or practice. See, and you know one more thing. If I told you just now, right? If we have been giving a particular meaning to a word since ages and ages, we have to continue to give that meaning. But all this while, if we were giving wrong meaning, then we have to correct the meaning. But don't correct the meaning. Continue to apply the wrong meaning if now changing the meaning is going to affect ownership of property or if it is going to affect everyday transactions. All along, if a wrong meaning was given, then please correct it. Hereafter, please apply correct meaning. But don't apply correct meaning. Continue to apply wrong meaning. If now changing the meaning into correct meaning, if this is going to affect ownership of property or if this is going to affect day-to-day transactions, then please continue to apply the wrong meaning itself. Are you understanding this? Yes. So this is the first secondary rule, which is about usage or practice. Our second secondary rule is very interesting. Associated words have to be interpreted in common sense manner. Nociter or sauces. This is a Latin maxim, nociter a sauces, which means the meaning of a word is to be judged by the company it keeps. See, I'll explain this to you with the help of an example. If you look at Income Tax Act, section 43B, it uses the words tax, duty, cess, or fee. Right? Section 43B of Income Tax Act uses these four words. Now, when you look at this word fee, if you want to understand the meaning of the word fee, does it include tuition fees also? Does it include electricity fees also? Does it include municipal fees also? That's a question before us. If you want to understand the meaning of a word, please do not read the word separately. See the context in which the word is used. See the surrounding words. See the companions of the word. See the friends of the word. Tax, duty, cess, all the three are something which we pay to the government, guys. So even fees will be only that fees which we pay to the government. Are you understanding this? So if you want to understand the meaning of a word, you will have to find the meaning keeping in mind the connected words, keeping in mind the meaning, keeping in mind the words which are around that word, keeping in mind the surrounding words. You can find the meaning of this word. Tax, duty, cess, all the three we pay to the government. So even fees, I'm talking only about those fees which I pay to the government. If you see nocitera sauces, this rule, and adjustum generis, aren't they similar? Even in adjustum generis, I'm trying to find the meaning of the word etc., keeping in mind the other surrounding words. Even over here, I'm trying to find the meaning of the word fee, keeping in mind the surrounding words. But adjustum generis is more specific. Adjustum generis has more conditions. There's a list, specific category, category not exhausted, followed by a general word. Then it is adjustum generis is more specific. Nos itera sources is not specific. It says there are multiple words. You want to find the meaning of a word, you see the surrounding words. That itself will help you understand the meaning of the word. Understand in cognate sense. Cognate sense means do not see every word separately. Read the words together. When I read tax, duty, cess or fee together, that will help me understand the actual meaning of this word fee. Got it, guys? So these are our two secondary rules. Our first secondary rule is usage or practice, which means that I am supposed to keep in mind customs. If a particular word has been interpreted in a particular manner since years and years, please continue to apply the same interpretation. This is optima lecum interpressest consuetudo. Then we learned that words undergo a change in meaning over time. So if you want to interpret properly, you go back in time and you see earlier what was the meaning of that particular word. When the law was made, at that time, what was the meaning of that particular word? That meaning you give even now. That will help you understand the real intention of the lawmaker. Okay, this is contemporanea expositio et optima et fortissima in lege. Contemporanea expositio est optima et fortissima in lege. Then we learnt about if a wrong meaning is being given all these years, please correct the meaning. But don't correct the meaning if correcting the meaning is going to affect title of property or if it is going to affect day-to-day transactions. Okay, guys, then coming to the next discussion, the last discussion that we had just now was about nos itera sources, associated words to be read in to be understood in common sense manner. This indicates that if you want to know the meaning of a word, please read the word in please try to find the meaning of the word from the surrounding words. If you look at the companions of the word, if you look at the words which are along with that word, with the help of these words, you will find the meaning of this word. Adjustum generis also is actually a subset of nos itera sources, but adjustum generis is more specific. It has more conditions. Only if all those conditions are fulfilled, there must be an enumeration belonging to a specific category. Then the category is not exhausted. The specific words are followed by a general word. All those conditions should be fulfilled. Only when all those conditions are fulfilled, only then I can apply adjustum generis. So no doubt adjustum generis is also nothing but a part of nos itera sources, but it is more specific. It is having more conditions than nos itera sources. Alright guys, so this was our discussion on the secondary rules. With this we have learned the primary rules and the secondary rules, and with this even the Latin maxims we are done. Okay, what are the last three Latin maxims we learned? First one was optima legum interpressest consuetudo. Then we learned contemporanea exposito est optima et fortissima in lege. Contemporanea expositio est optima et fortissima in lege. Then finally we learned nos itera sources, which means try to understand the meaning of the word with the company it keeps, with the companions of that word. Okay, did we understand nos itera sources properly, guys? Yes, fine. Now listen, with this we come to an end to the third part of the chapter. In the first part, we had learnt about 3 to 4 basic definitions. In the second part, we had learnt all about interpretation. In the third part, we learnt about the primary rules and then we learnt about the secondary rules of interpretation. The primary rules we learned the rule of literal construction, then we learned about the rule of reasonable construction, then we learned about the rule of harmonious construction, after which the rule of beneficial construction, then adjustum generis, and finally exceptional construction. Then under secondary rules, only two secondary rules we had. One was about usage or practice and the second was about nos itera sources, associated words.